start. Om Amriteshwariye Namaha. My humble pranams at the lotus feet of Amma, Sadguru, Sri Mata Amritanandamayi Devi, the founder and foundation of Amrita Vidaypeetham. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the international webinar on a systemic approach in studying food, organized by the Department of English, Amrita School of Arts and Sciences. To start the session, I request Ms. Kavya Purushothaman, Senior Faculty of Department of English, to offer the prayer. Offer to Mrs. Kavya.
Sahana bhavatu, sahanau bhunaktu, sahaviryam karavavahai, tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidyashavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om Asato ma Satgamaya, Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti, Shanti. Om Lo bhavantu, loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino. Shanti, Shanti. Om Sarvesham Bhavatu, Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu, Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om.
Thank you so much, Kavya. Now, Dr. U. Krishna Kumar, our director, has always been the driving force and pillar of support in all our endeavors. May I request sir to kindly deliver the welcome address and introduce the speaker.
My most respected salutations to the Chancellor of the Amrita Vidaypeetham University, world-renowned humanitarian leader as well as a spiritual master. It is our incessant grace that brought us all together for this very important international webinar on trying to decipher the different aspects of the food studies. And let me at the outset thank Dr. Sina, the head of the Department of English Language and Literature at the Kochi campus of the Amrita School of Arts and Sciences, under the Amrita University, for having coordinated and organized this event. And all the more, let me express my thanks to Ashwin, a senior research scholar of the department. He has gone into the advanced candidacy of his PhD by having finished his qualifying examinations also. A very warm welcome, good evening, and most respectful salutations to our guest of honor of the evening, Dr. Fabio, Parasecoli. Before introducing a very rich profile of Professor Fabio Parasecoli, on behalf of Vidyamritam University, as well as on behalf of hundreds of participants all over the world who are participating in this webinar, both through the Microsoft Teams as well as the YouTube private webcast. A hearty welcome to Professor Fabio Parasecoli. Let me take this opportunity to introduce him in whatever way possible. I take your pardon if I am wrong in pronouncing any names of any of the universities or centers which have been spelled probably not in English. I take pardon in advance. Professor Fabio Parasecoli is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at the New York University. He has a PhD in Agricultural Sciences from 𝐒𝐭𝐮𝐲 University in Stuttgart, Germany. And when I look at his profile, I'm dumbfounded. There is no area in this world where he hasn't touched. Starting from this basic domain area of agricultural sciences, he has gone into politics, he has gone into many other areas. He has done versatile spree of learning. This is what it shows. Always has been an incessant learner. He had his post-graduation MA in Political Sciences from the Istituto Universitario Orientale, Naples in Italy. He had his graduation and post-graduation in Modern Foreign Languages and Literature from the University La Sapienza in Roma in Italy. He also holds a certificate in Islamic Studies from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies at Rome, Italy. And he also has a graduate fellowship in the History Department at Beijing University in China. A very versatile person who has touched various streams of knowledge. It's really surprising to see that this person has gone, this professor, great professor, has traveled through many boards and ultimately landed up at the food sciences. Maybe that's not yet. Professor Fabio's research explores the intersections among food, media, politics, and in particular the fields of food, heritage, and intellectual property. His most recent projects focus on food design and synergies between food studies and design. After covering the Middle and Far Eastern political issues, he wrote for many years as a US correspondent for Gambago Rosso, the Italy's most authoritative food and wine magazine. His recent books include 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐧𝐚, The History of Food in Italy, 2014, translated into Italian in 2015, and into Korean in 2018. Feasting Our Eyes, Food, Film and Cultural Citizenship in the US, 2016, he authored with Laura Lindenfeld, Knowing Where It Comes From, Labeling Traditional Foods to Compete in a Global Market, 2017, and Food, 2019 in the MIT Press series, Essential Knowledge series. White Meme, Food in Popular Culture, in Berg in 2008, and the Food Culture in Italy, Greenwood, 2004. It is amazing to notice that one of the things what we consume, which is most essential to our living, sustaining our life, is such an important topic. Current research projects include a 3-year grant from the National Science Center for Poland to explore the revolution of traditional and regional food in Poland. He is a Fulbright specialist grant to study the food heritage creation, approaches and processes, and is working on a big project on Global Brooklyn, a restaurant and cafe design and service approach that has reached worldwide visibility, and is working on the workshop that connect the food studies, ethnography, and design. Here you find in Professor Fabio Parasecoli, a person who cannot be defined by his domain areas, most interdisciplinary and cutting across all ethnographic, cutting across all disciplines. I think he hasn't, probably he may be using the computer science, which is my background, but he hasn't gone into the probably the artificial intelligence and such areas, connecting that to food also. Probably he might do it anyway. And my full prayers to the Almighty to give him all the strength, vitality to continue his sojourn of research into more interdisciplinary areas so that it will be benefited by the whole world. Most hearty welcome to Professor Fabio Parasecoli, and welcome to all the participants of this international webinar. Welcome you once again, and a very good evening to all of you. Now, I request Professor Fabio Parasecoli to kindly take over from me.
Well, thank you so much for these kind words. I don't know what to say except that I'm very happy to have received the invitation. I traveled to Kerala 3 years ago, and I'm happy to see that the connection is still there. And I think it was a wonderful place to visit. I have great memories, but also really helped me think differently about food and politics and such matters. As a matter of fact, I've just started working on a new book that will focus specifically on how food is used as an ideological tool in politics. And, you know, the US will be featured, Italy, Poland, but also India will be featured big in this book. From that point of view, it's one of the most interesting places in the world. So I would start immediately. Oh, and I asked, I'm sorry about this animal that, you know, when you work from home, you have pets, but hopefully he won't disturb us too much. I will share my presentation, and hopefully we tested yesterday and it was working fine.
Yeah, it's working.
It's working.
You can go ahead, sir.
And I'm trying to make it, okay, there we go. So, as was pointed out in the introduction, food studies is a very interdisciplinary field. And that's why, you know, I've been working in politics and media. Now I'm working quite a bit in design. And I think that is because food is such a fundamental part of our life that it penetrates different aspects of what we do, who we are as a society, how we think about ourselves. So I've written about food also for the general public, and I think that's a very important element for us as academics to keep on doing our research, but also communicating to other people. And so that's how the book that I just showed with MIT happened. They saw my blog and what I was writing about, very different topics. And so they asked me to write a volume for this series called Essential Knowledge. And the point is, how do you explain such a complicated topic in an easy and accessible way, keeping your research and your knowledge in the background and making it available in a simple way to the general public. So this was the challenge. And that's why I started thinking what could be, a point of view to show all that food is. And I decided to start thinking of food from a systemic point of view. And that also has some methodological impacts on how we study food. And we'll talk more about that. So the study of food is not only interdisciplinary, it requires collaborations between historians and anthropologists and sociologists and scientists, but also it looked at an object that it's inherently complex, with many connections within and without itself. So I decided to point out a few main issues that I think are important and that can be looked at in a systemic way. My premise for the book is that as consumers, we are also citizens, meaning that our choices not only express our preferences, what we like to do, what we like to eat, but also in a way help shaping the society in which we live. Our choices express maybe our social background, our culture, our political preferences. So in this picture, you have a beautiful image of organic food at a farmer's market. And, here in the US, you think, what kind of people can access that sort of food? Who has the cultural background? Who has also the monetary means, the actual money, to go and buy food that might be a little more expensive? When I was in India, I realized, you could buy vegetables at the little cart on the street, or you could choose to go to a nice air-conditioned supermarket. What does it say about us as citizens? The very presence of such different structures and the fact that we choose to go to one place or another. What does it say about us? What does it say about our society? A very important element that I think we have to keep in mind is that whatever we do, whatever we choose to buy, whatever we eat, our personal choices or family choices or community choices are actually part of a much larger system that connects places all around the world. Here there is an image of, a banana picker, and bananas, it's something that we have on our tables. They are very cheap. So how do bananas from such far away place manage to get to our table so cheap? What are the connections? When I was in India, bananas were everywhere, but they are grown there. So for Indians, especially in southern India, bananas are local food. For us, I don't know, I grew up in Italy, now I live in the US, bananas are not. So every time we eat something, we become part of this very complex, very large networks that connect us as consumers and citizens with the rest of the world. Same thing when we eat a chocolate bar. Where is chocolate grown? Who grows it? Who picks it? How does it get to us? What are all the steps? So how can we think about this food system? We can have a couple of different approaches. The one on the left you know, you have all the different elements, the biological system, the economic system, the social systems, and we can imagine that our food system, it's built like this, you know, interconnected pieces, but every piece has got its place, everything is connected, everything works. The reality of the food system is more what we see on the right. So it's something that it's very complex, very multidimensional, where each node is connected in all directions. So it's not enough to look at supply chain. Supply chains are a very useful tool to make managerial decisions, but they do not reflect the complexity of what allows, I don't know, bananas to get on my table, or for Italian wines to be available in an Indian restaurant. The food system, it's open and evolving. There are so many interwoven elements, but also so many players that have conflicting values and goals. So the interest of me as a consumer of bananas is different from the interest of the store that sells me the banana, different from the importers that bring the bananas into the US, different from the transporter, different from the exporter, and definitely different from the people who are actually growing the bananas. We have to realize that this conflict of values and goals makes the food system work, but it also makes it more complicated to think about. So we have to move from a linear thinking model where we see, you know, like little chains, little links in a chain, to a mode of looking at things that it's systemic, and where we can see how certain elements become circular. So what is thrown out then maybe become, you know, compost for something that follows. So continuing on thinking, you know, of our connections with the first, with our food system, we can define it as a wicked problem. This is something that I've learned working with designers, and it's quite important. And these are some of the characteristics. There is no clear definition. As we said, it's always expanding, always evolving. It's multi-causal, multi-scalar, interconnected, multiple stakeholders, different organizations, and so on and so forth. It's like cover, right? A small cover, and you're cold. Maybe you have to choose between covering your chest or covering your feet. Whatever you choose has unintended consequences. So we have to start thinking at the food system in this way, like a complex system that it's not linear and has many of the characteristics of what designers call wicked problems. Now, in the book, but also in the way I teach, I always try to start from what people are more familiar with. And so those are our choices. And health and nutrition are definitely among the most important elements. And they are connected with social elements or maybe with religious elements. We choose what we eat also because, you know, we have certain beliefs. So what would seem like a very personal choice, in reality, it's connected with so many elements, and also it's more and more influenced by media. You know, we're part of this interconnected world where social media allows us to see what happens around us, but also at the same time influences the way we think about the world. Now, there are personal choices, but also nutrition become a systemic issue when it comes to labels. So what happens when citizens, when shoppers go to the store and have to make choices about what to buy. And the politics behind these labels are huge because, of course, producers have their interests, politicians have their interests, consumers have their interests, dietitians, the health establishment have their system. So every country adopts different system that can reflect the choices made at the political level. So what seems like a tool to help us make healthy choices, in reality, is the result of very complicated systemic choices. I think there is somebody with the microphone on. If you can mute it, thank you. Another important element that about nutrition that we have to look systemically is food in school. Of course, the main goal is to nourish children. And, you know, in many countries, that's part of what the government does. But again, what gets given to the children, the food, the choices about food, the quantity of food, is determined by this very complex system of competing actors. You have the governments, you have the schools, you have the parents, you have doctors, and then you have the kids themselves. In a country like in the US, where, you know, food is more available and abundant, although now, you know, with COVID, we see more and more people who have problems feeding themselves. We can see that changing diets at school can be difficult because maybe children don't like certain things, and so they throw them out. So how can you tackle this element? As a matter of fact, food waste is one of the most important issues that we experience personally, you know, seeing what our children eat or throw out, or seeing what we have in our fridge and goes bad. But sometimes it acquires systemic dimensions. We have food loss at every step of food production, distribution, retail, and then food waste in our kitchens, in our fridges. Definitely food waste is a very important issue because, you know, thousands of tons of food go bad every year. But it's one of those issues that can be solved only looking at it systemically, trying to understand what are the different components, who are the different actors, how do we end up with throwing out so much food. And one of the elements is to look at its connection with how we produce food and how much our agricultural system has become industrialized and mechanized, and, you know, how many inputs we use, fertilizers and pesticides, and we need oil to make the machine work and all of that. That way of growing food is thought and planned to create high yields, to have abundance, to have convenience. But at the same time, this abundance and this convenience creates loss on the way of the food from the field to the table. And so every actor, every institution, every link, every node should be looked at to see how to not only reduce waste, but also to improve the impact of agriculture on our environment. Agriculture and animal farming are among the biggest cause of environmental issues, and they also impact climate change. Usually we think the other way around. We think about how climate change impacts agriculture. But also agriculture impacts climate change. The way we use water, the way we use the soil, the techniques that we choose in growing food have an impact on climate. Actually, a colleague of mine, Sonali McDermott, here at NYU, has done studies of how irrigation in India and the models of agriculture are having an impact on the monsoons, which are the most important elements in providing water to Indian agriculture. So this brings us to another element that connects with the rest, but also needs to be thought about systemically, and that's technology, risk management. For instance, the example of the genetically modified organisms. There are huge debates around the world. Are they good for people? Are they bad for people? Are they good for the environment? Are they bad for the environment? Now, from the point of view of human health, there is still no definitive answer. We know that from the environmental point of view, they're complicated because they can have an impact on biodiversity. They can introduce species that can be destructive and so on and so forth. But one element that usually we don't think about, and it comes up if we think about technology and food systemically, is intellectual property. So who owns the patents for those seeds? Who makes money out of those seeds? How do farmers get the money to use those seeds and also to use the inputs that are necessary to grow them? India is a very interesting case from this point of view because there is a whole market for the so-called stealth seeds. So GMO seeds that are taken by farmers and breeded and crossed with local varieties. And so we've seen cotton and eggplants and other products in India that, in a way, break intellectual property and somehow give farmers more agency in choosing, what to grow, what to sell. From that point of view, India is also very interesting in the experiments in maintaining agrobiodiversity. So there are initiatives in which farmers select, local varieties and create banks that are open for free to all the farmers. And those are very interesting experiments. They can be, low tech, but they can also be very high tech. You're all aware that there are, very technologically advanced seed banks in places like, the Arctic, where, also the cold maintains the seed. But my point here is that we cannot think about technology without thinking about the environment and long-term sustainability, without thinking about the different actors and institutions that are involved in those choices. And this is particularly important when we see the adoption of new technologies in agriculture. As we've mentioned, agriculture has been industrialized. There is the use of and automation. The use of automatic machine and robots is increasing. What does that mean? Who makes those choices? Because for some people, that can be good. It increases yields, it increases the harvest, and decreases the need for workers, for laborers. But how about the workers? What's their say in those choices? And I'm not saying we need to go back to a past without technology. That doesn't make sense. The issue is, for me, who are the actors that have a say in technological decisions? What does those decisions tell us about the political dynamics, the social dynamics, the economic dynamics? You see, I go back over and over to the fact that food needs to be studied interdisciplinary. in this conversation about technologies, we need scientists, we need technologists, but we also need sociologists and anthropologists and politicians. And so technology is not bad per se. In this picture, we have the image of a farmer that just using a little phone, it's not even a smartphone, you know, very often text is enough, but farmers now can use phones to access data networks and get very useful information about the weather, about pests, about the prices of fertilizers and other material they might need, the prices of their own crops. So when they go to the market, they know more or less what's the price, and it's easier for them to sell at better prices. There is a growing use, for instance, of sensor in fields that tell farmers, you know, when it's dry, when there is need for irrigation. There is the use of drones that can also help farmers. But again, where does this technology come from? How accessible is it to farmers? Is it accessible only to, you know, large farms or richer farmers? How accessible is it to small holders? And who makes money out of it? And more importantly, what happens to all the data that these machineries, these interconnected machineries through data networks generate? Data are becoming a more important resource than they were before, because they can be used to create new technology, to make political choices, to make environmental choices. So who owns the data? Who has access to it? These are also very important issues that needs to be thought in this multidisciplinary way, connecting the different nodes in the system. And the food system would not exist without infrastructures. Very often they're invisible. We know that for us to get frozen food, there needs to be a cold chain that connects the field to factories where the food is frozen, to transportation networks that can maintain low temperature, to stores that have fridges that can maintain low temperature, and that consumers at home have low temperature fridges. While this cold chain, for instance, in a place like the US, it's given for granted, in India, people are much more aware of it because it's growing, but it still has holes here and there. And how many people do have that kind of fridges? How many stores can have fridges? Are there enough refrigerated trucks to do this? And the presence of absence of this infrastructure, of this invisible infrastructure, is again connected with economic choices, with political choices, with social structure. And we cannot just think of them independently from the rest. Food infrastructures are particularly important because they allow food to get from producers to consumers. And so they have a central role in understanding hunger and in understanding food security. Now, here in the US, there is this idea that people should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstrap, meaning that, you know, if a person doesn't have enough to eat, it's their responsibility. They haven't worked hard enough. They haven't done all they need. That's clearly unfunded, because what a person can buy, what a person can do depends on so many factors, on their background, or on their education, or on their class, or on their access to social connections. And now I must say, with the COVID, people are changing a little bit their mindset. So many people who had jobs, who had middle-class lives, suddenly don't have to eat. I mean, don't have anything to eat. They have to eat, but they don't have anything to eat. And so they have to go to soup kitchens and get food. So people are getting a little more sensitive to the issue of food as human right, which, for instance, for India, is quite clear and it's quite central. There is no discussion about it. Here in the US, with this concept that, you know, everybody's responsible for themselves, whatever their background, whatever their story is, there is a little more resistance to think of food as a human right, something that everybody needs access to. Soup kitchens and food banks definitely play a huge role. Very often they are connected with religious institutions. And I know in India, for instance, there are temples that sometimes do distribution of food to the needy. There are political parties that do that. And that's a crucial part of our food system. But again, thinking systemically, we should think, well, okay, why are there so many people that need that support, that need that help? What could we do to change that situation? Here in the US, paradoxically, very often, the same food companies that pay very little, very low wages to their workers are there the companies that give free food to soup kitchens and food banks to give to the poor. You see the systemic contradiction that is there. And the same contradictions happen in international aid. Of course, international aid is important. If there is a war, if there is a hurricane, if there is an emergency, it's great that food arrives there. But the issues are a little more complicated than political. In normal situations, for instance, why are countries like the US keeping on sending, you know, corn and wheat and ready food instead of investing with the farmers in those places? So I don't know if Somalia has a long-term production crisis, the US might send corn and other food, which, by the way, helps the US government to get rid of excess production. But at the same time, when this food gets there and it's distributed for free or at very low prices, it undermines local farmers that have a competition that is too strong. And so food aid sometimes hits the local farmers. So you see how something that looks positive and good sometimes has got very complicated systemic interconnections. So thinking systemically also should help us think about the future. We know that there is a nutritional transition. For instance, in China, people are eating much more meat than they used to eat before. And you know, it's a big part of humanity. In India also, people are eating more meat. They're eating more eggs, more dairy. What does it mean at the global level when there is so much demand for animal protein? What does it mean in terms of the fields that are necessary to grow the feed to feed these animals? Will there be less food for humans? So there is a lot of debate about the need to move back to a vegetable-based diet that would be more sustainable. Is it possible? Those are big questions, and they need to be assessed and analyzed systemically. The same thing happened with the financialization of the food system. Here is an image of, the end of Lehman Brothers back in 2007-8. More and more, there are financial institutions, hedge funds, sovereign funds, pension funds that are finding investment in food commodities an interesting investment. What does it mean? What are the consequences on food producers? What are the consequences on government? What are the consequences on consumers? What we've seen so far is not so good. Precisely in 2008, because of the financialization of food, we saw spikes in the prices of rice, of corn, of wheat that led to demonstrations and riots around the world. This is an image from Cairo in Egypt, but there were demonstrations in Cameroon, in Haiti, in Indonesia. So we might not think that our pension fund might have an impact on the ability of this person to buy bread for his family. So as we think about the future, we need to embrace the complexity of food system, which require starting thinking in a different way, thinking about complexity, thinking about systems rather than just, linear connection between fields and the table. And I will stop here so that we would have some time for conversation. Let's see, how can I get out of this? I'm trying to figure out how I get out. Unfortunately, I'm not very familiar with the system, so maybe it's, there we go, found it. So if there are questions, I cannot see the questions, but if somebody can, relate the questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yes, some of the participants are from outside organization, so I would request them to come up with the questions. They can't even post in the chat. So yes, if you have any questions. Yes, Kumud, you can unmute and ask.
Hi, Professor Fabio. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you. I had a quick question. I am a student of food and I have a master's of food studies from Italy. And I've come back to India and I find myself extremely overwhelmed by the food system here. And, there's so many directions that I get pulled in. And I just wanted to ask you for some sort of guidance. How do I go about understanding food systems, say specifically in India?
Well, if you start thinking about the food system in India, it's, of course, you get overwhelmed. It's one of the most complex in the world, not only in terms of dimension, but also in terms of complexity, of diversity and whatnot. I think also as, somebody who's finished studying, somebody who needs to work, I would look at maybe some of the nodes that you're more familiar with, that you can have a say on, or you can intervene, or you can work on. Because of course, working on the whole system requires government interventions. So one possibility could be to work for the government, but very often governments don't think like this about food, at least for here in the US. And this is something that I've noticed during the electoral campaign. Neither Trump nor Biden talked about food system at a moment in which so many Americans don't have enough to eat. So let's keep the governments out of, national governments, but there might be local governments that are interested in doing something. Or there might be private companies that maybe want to innovate in some ways. They might be startups. I would recommend that you look at scales and dimensions, nodes, you can actually have an intervention. Take it from there, and then starting from there, you acquire an experience, and maybe you become a little more visible, and you can work on something bigger. Looking directly at the whole food system, I don't think, as a young person coming out of school, I don't think that would be the right way to go. Of course, it's overwhelming. There is no other way.
Thank you. I'll think about that. Thank you.
Yes. Any more questions? Yes, Repa, you can ask question. You can unmute and ask. Yeah.
Evening from Indonesia. Yeah.
Can
My
you
name is
repeat
Fabio from
that?
Indonesia and finding issues events from.
I cannot understand. I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question, Repa?
Maybe she can write the questions and you can read it to me because I can hear you well.
Oh, yeah, but I don't think she is a guest. She is outside the organization.
Okay.
I don't know if she can... Yes, Grishma. Please unmute. Grishma. Grishma, please unmute and ask.
We're all still getting used to online conferences.
Grishma, are you there? I think she can't unmute or something.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Dr. Karthika, is there any questions from the YouTube?
As far as now, we have no questions, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Shruti Francis, please unmute.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, let me thank the organizers, a very wonderful session, and thank you, Mr. Fabio, for the insightful session. And my question, I don't know, is it a question? Something which is not related to your talk, but something which is deviating from the talk, in the sense, how to approach culinary narratives. Can you give me some guidance for culinary narratives? How to approach culinary narratives as a fiction? How can we analyze culinary narratives?
Yeah.
Is it only the nostalgia or the emotion that we can study on food studies, food narratives, or something else that we can focus on the food narratives?
I don't think it's just nostalgia. I think, I don't know, if you're looking at a 19th century novel, you can look, for instance, as how food is used to represent the society. And if you look at both the literary representation and you know about the food in that place and that time, you can see how authors have used food in a way to create characters or to push the story ahead or just to create the sense of a background. I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that, literary fiction is fiction. And so when food appears, it's not just a reflection, but it's a narrative choice of the writer to use food in a certain way at a certain point with certain characters. Maybe it can be used to allow two characters to talk each other. Maybe it can be used to show inequalities in that society. I'm not a literary specialist, but I've done a lot of work in movies, film, and it's quite similar. So, for instance, I've written an article about how food was used in movies after World War II in Italy, in neorealism. And we can see that food is very, very important. But it also was clear that those filmmakers were using food politically to make a statement about what was going on in the country, the lack of food after the war, the inequalities in the society, about the future of Italy. So I think when you deal with literary narratives, similar situation. Why is the author using food? How is it using it? What does they want to tell us?
Thank you. If you don't mind, can you just tell me the article that you have written on Second World War, the movies?
I can't remember the title, but if you look at my last name on Google and you put Italy neorealist film, you should find it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Grishma, are you there? Grishma?
Ma'am.
Yeah, just wait. Grishma, are you there? No, Kartika, yes, you can.
Okay, ma'am. We have one question from Fabio, and he is asking about facilitating the connection between different fields and areas of knowledge towards food system, and what do we need?
Yeah, that's the whole, it's a core issue in food studies because it's the issue of interdisciplinarity. Basically, there is no limit if you think about it, because food is so interconnected in all our dimensions of life that if you start from the field, you start with agrarian science, agricultural sciences, but those are connected with biology. They are connected with technology now because food is produced with machinery and all of that. It's very important, to have collaboration with engineers and designers that help us understand, the infrastructural elements of the food system. It's important to think about political sciences, anthropology, sociology, economics. This has also an impact on practical projects. For instance, in the past, I've collaborated with a chef from Nigeria. His name is Michael Elegbede. And he organized a series of meetings to start thinking how to affect, the Nigerian food system. And this also is a response for the previous question, what can I do? Well, they decided to put together chefs, food producers, designers, but also people in the business, in the distribution of food. And then they were reaching out to designer engineers because, for instance, they realized one of the crucial issues in Nigeria is to bringing food from one place to another. And to make available what farmers grow, maybe to chefs that would be ready maybe to pay a little more than in the normal market, but they don't know how to connect themselves with these farmers. And so they started small, connecting a few chefs in restaurants in Lagos, in the capital city, and they organized this 2 or 3 days meeting in which all these players started collaborating, trying to figure out practical solution for this one problem. Connection between farmers and chefs. But that could be the beginning to start thinking about larger infrastructural issues in Nigeria. So the connection between different fields of knowledge is infinite in a way. I think for each project we deal with, we can think strategically what methods and what fields of knowledge we can apply. For instance, now in my research in Poland, I'm using ethnographic methods, and so the connection with anthropology is very strong, but I'm also doing political analysis, so political sciences. I'm looking at media, and so there is all the communication sciences, semiotics, but I'm also looking at the history of the food in Poland, so I'm working a lot with historians. So I think the connections are infinite. The choices might be determined by the specific projects we're working on.
Okay, thank you, sir. I hope the question is addressed. And we have one more question from Sakshi Dogra, and she's asking if you could comment upon the synesthetic nature of food.
Oh, wow. Well, here we go. And this, for instance, in this field, a connection is necessary with neuroscientists. Because of course, you know, when we eat, we look at the food, we smell it, we taste it. But there is more than that. Our body moves. So for instance, the kinetics property of our body is fundamental, and also what neuroscientists call proprioception, the sensation of being oneself, of being me. Those are all very important sensory inputs that interact with what's already in our brain in terms of memories. But we don't have to think of memories as computer files, right? We have, when we want to write something, basically we put it in a file, it's in a folder. When we need it, we click on it, and it reopens exactly the way we wrote it, exactly the way we put it in. Memories don't work like that, because first of all, the origin of memory is very much connected with the sensory element, but with the emotional element. When we eat, if we are terrified, our food memories will be different than if we're eating the same food, maybe at a wedding, or maybe at a nice dinner with friends. So the origin of memories is already influenced by senses and by emotions. But also when we retrieve those memories, our physical situation, our emotional situation, our context will impact the way the memories are retrieved. So in a way, the senses, our body, our memories, all work together to create, you know, the experience of food, the synesthetic experience of food.
Kartika, just a second. There is a guest, Mary Amrita. Can you please unmute?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good afternoon.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about the definition of a typical food from certain region, because based on the situation in Indonesia, I am from Indonesia, living in Belgium. Indonesia consume a lot of spicy foods, especially derived from chili. However, chili is not natively from Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And then we produce a lot of pepper. However, we don't really use as much as pepper or other spicy food like we use for chili. How to define typical food, or how to characterize that this food or these spices is really characterize certain region?
Mm-hmm. I think the best way to go is observe what people actually do. So looking at the origin of food doesn't make much sense, because food has been traveling around the world since the beginning of humanity.
Right.
I don't know, it was adopted and domesticated in the Near East, like in Turkey and Syria, and then, we find it in China. And things worked like this all the time. Sugar was probably domesticated in Papua New Guinea, and then, Alexander the Great found it in India, and then it appeared in the Mediterranean, and then the Spaniards and the Portuguese brought it to the Americas. So the place of domestication of food doesn't say much, because food historically has been traveling. For me, typicality is how much is this food part of not only the culinary tradition, but also the production. So in your case, from what I hear, you're saying that you produce a lot of pepper and lots of spices that people don't actually consume locally, but they're used for export.
Yes.
And on the other hand, they use a lot of chili. Well, they're both typical in different way. One is typical in a gastronomic sense, because it's used widely. It's important for, the way people eat. But those other spices are probably typical for producers. What allows them not only to survive, but also to have sort of an identity in the international market. Probably, there are specific variety of peppers that over the years have been selected in Indonesia that maybe are different from the pepper varieties that we might find in Kerala, which is probably one of the original places of pepper, right? So, and this is now also become part of, international system of intellectual property. The whole concept of geographical indication is based precisely on that. So that's one way of thinking of typicality. But then there are the habits, the uses, the behaviors of people. If chili pepper is so important for Indonesian cuisine, I would say that it's typical in a way of Indonesia.
So you meant that sometimes it is also could be differ according to the certain period of time.
Oh, well, of course, typicality changes over time. I mean, if you think about Italian food, all Italians think of coffee as part of their daily life. It's really part of the typical Italian food. Coffee is definitely not Italian, and to this day is not grown in Italy. It's imported. But in a way, so if we think of typicality of something that is just grown and consumed in a place, then coffee is not typical. But if we think of typicality as part of daily life, well, then coffee is typical of Italy too, because also is prepared in very specific way, is roasted in specific way, is consumed in specific ways. Those are typical. Even the coffee is per se not typical of Italy.
So
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. How many more questions can we take?
Maybe a couple of more, because then, I've got my classes. Here in the US is the beginning of the day. I have my class on food and design today.
Oh, Kartika, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Sir, we have one more question. The questionnaire has asked that he has read an article titled "Brad Pitt is the Laurence Olivier of Eating in Cinema," and you were referenced in that piece. Yeah. Do you follow the transition in Brad Pitt's eating habits in cinema?
Yes. I love movies. I love cinema. So I watch a lot of them and I write about them. And I've looked at how the representations of food have changed over time. First of all, food was present in cinema from the beginning. If you look at the oldest movies, the Lumiere brothers in France, or, you know, silent movies in the US, food is already there. And at the time was very important to create actions. You know, you slip on a banana peel, you throw a cream pie in somebody's face. You know, people didn't talk, so physical activity was very important. Over time, food starts being used to, you know, present, to give a sense of reality to the background. You know, if you're talking about, if you're making a movie about, you know, the Western movies in the US, you would have people eating, I don't know, what viewers would think of Western food, and so on and so forth. So the presence of food has been always very powerful. What happened around in the mid-'80s, and that's a big change, and that's what I cover in my book, Feasting Your Eyes, is that food is not just part of the background, or it's a tool to tell stories. We were talking before narratives, right? Starting from the late 80s, we have movies in which food is the protagonist. It becomes the center. And so we have Babette's Feast, for instance. It's one of the first ones. Beautiful movie. And so starting from that time, first in Europe, and then in other parts of the world, we have the development of what I call a food genre, where food becomes really the center. For instance, in India, one of my favorite food movies is The Lunchbox, that came out, I think, 2012, 2013. I remember it came out when I was in Bangalore. I was doing research in Bangalore, and I went to see it at the movies, and I immediately loved it. And there are so many movies now that put food as the core of the narrative. It's sort of like its own character that interacts like with other characters. And we see that also happening in the documentaries. We have more and more food documentaries that might focus on production. Here in the US, we have lots of documentaries that are very critical of the industrial food system. But we also have documentaries that look, for instance, at the traditions. Netflix has a series on street food. We have documentaries that look at great chefs. So also in the field of documentary, we see a growth of food movies. I think it's partly because food has become more central in media in general. We have food channels. We have, I don't know, master chefs. Remember when I was in Bangalore, everybody was talking about master chefs India, or how important it was to create sort of a foodie culture. And now we have social media where people can go to Instagram and see pictures taken in another part of the world and immediately connect to that. So I think this emergence of food in movies is also part of this larger phenomenon.
Okay, thank you, sir. Shall we move on to the next question, sir?
Okay.
So we have a question from Repa Kustipia, and she's asking, what is the best method and analysis to write food and culture for indigenous people or for the common public?
Oof, that's a big question, very big question. I think using ethnographic methods, it's a good way to do that. Meaning that, especially if you're looking at indigenous populations, you might want to see what they do, hear what they say, but it's very important that, you know, we let the people speak in a way. We have a long tradition, especially unfortunately in Western anthropology, of the Western person going there and sort of interpret the locals through the eyes of the foreigners. So it is very important to let people speak, and that is also important, you know, for instance, Rupa, I think from Indonesia, there might be indigenous populations that maybe are marginalized within Indonesia. And maybe, you know, there is the tendency from the government or for cultural institutions to sort of impose certain point of view. It becomes very important to find methodologies that allow us to actually let these people express themselves. What are, besides, you know, what they do, their customs that we can observe, but what are their meanings? Why are they doing what they do? Why is it relevant for them? So, in a way, some culturally sensitive, socially sensitive ethnography might be important. Also, you have to look at, for instance, you go into a community and suddenly, I don't know, you have only older people talking to you. Then you should wonder why and try to see if you can get something from younger people. In another community, maybe men have more to, you know, louder voice than women. So how can you have access to women? How can you talk to them? When I was in Kerala, I remember in a college, I can't remember which one, I participated in home economics class. And we made different dishes. And for me, that was a very important moment because I could see these women in an environment where they felt comfortable. It was not a conference, it was a kitchen. And in a way, by cooking with them, I allowed them to teach me. That somehow flipped the relation, you know, the foreign professor coming to give a conference. No, now it's this weird white person that doesn't even know how to make, you know, something on the grill. And so the conversations and the behaviors changed. So it's a question also for the researchers to be ready and willing to put oneself into uncomfortable situations.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Maybe one last question, because by 10 at the latest, I have to go and start my other class.
Okay, sir. So we have one question from Grishma Pillai, and she is asking about, can you please explain how the food consumption and psychology of people is related?
Ooh. These are all huge questions. It's not like little things, but okay. Well, I think from the beginning, as we are born and we develop ourselves, you know, food become one of the filters through which we relate to the world. But more importantly, it's a filter through which we relate to those who are around us. And so, you know, the relationship with our mother, first of all, and what it means to get nourishment from your mother, first physically, and then, you know, as you get weaned, introduction to different foods. So the very fact that food becomes the connection between us and the world gives it a huge psychological importance. As I was mentioning before, it can be connected with, I don't know, your family and what family means to you, and community and what community means to you. But it can also have connection with personal stories, you know, with certain memories or certain traumas, certain fears. So the impact of our psychology on food is huge, and there is ongoing research on that, which it's also very important if you think about it, about marketing, because somehow people want to understand why we buy what we buy. why we choose certain things. Where do our preferences come from? So there is a lot of work for applied psychology in this case to try to understand the behaviors, but also what's behind the behaviors. And marketers have been leveraging that at least from the 1960s. They want to know what we like. They want to know what we're ready to buy. They also want to know how much we're ready to pay for it. That's also psychological, right? We want to spend a lot of money to feel that, you know, we're well off. We have financial stability, or do we prefer cheaper food? What are the psychological implications of that? I mean, there are whole courses on food and psychology. So these are just, you know, a few quick answers, but there is also a lot of material already being published. So if you're interested in that, it should be an easy field to research.
Thank you, sir. I hope we have one more interesting question. If you could.
Okay. Last one.
So this is from Dr. Beena Nair from Amritapuri campus of Amrita College, and she's asking about, could you please comment on the transformative or spiritual power of food? Is there any spiritual power for food?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the very fact that food is so important for religion already shows, you know, the sort of the spiritual connection, but that also connects with what we were talking about before about psychology. Sometimes, you know, maybe having the courage to taste something new can be transformative, because it can give you a different experience of yourself, of how you're ready to deal with your fear. Food can be transformative, for instance, when you're invited to certain celebrations. I remember once I was in Syria, it was Ramadan. I'm not Muslim, but people invited me over to eat. And that was a very important experience, because you realize, you know, the value of food in that specific spiritual tradition. The very fact of sharing food with people that are close to you can be emotionally transformative. And also cooking for people can be emotionally transformative, because suddenly you start caring about nourishing other people. You start caring about other people's well-being, but also about their pleasure, their happiness. You try to cook something good, something that they like. So food, yes, is definitely transformative in at many levels, from, you know, simple psychological, behavioral level to the most spiritual ones.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
So as we have come to an end to the question and answer session, thank you very much, sir, for patiently answering the questions from our participants. And thank you, Dr. Karthika and Dr. Srina, for taking us through the question and answer session. As we have come to an end of this wonderful session, our department head, Dr. Srina, who has been who has been our confidence and our support to undertake such a great, listening to you. Actually, it has been our wish, our dream. Okay, so sir, thank you very much, sir. And I request Dr. Srina, on behalf of all of us, to propose the vote of thanks now.
Thank you, Geethamma. I would make it very brief. Om Amriteshwari Nama, my humble pranams to all. The Department of English at Amrita School of Arts and Science is truly indebted to Professor Fabio Parasecoli for giving us such an exclusive and enlightening talk on various approaches on food studies. On behalf of the faculty, students, and all who gathered here from all around the world, I extend my humble gratitude to you, sir. Thank you, sir. Dr. 𝐒𝐭𝐮𝐝, our director, the guiding spirit and strong supporter of all our interviewers, a big thank you to you, sir, for being with us. I thank the esteemed participants from various parts of the world for joining with us and indulging in academic discourses like this. I thank faculty, research scholars, students of the department for their support. I especially thank Mr. Ashwin